Arrays are another data type in JavaScript, and they're useful when we're working with lists of things. So an array looks like this. It's simply just open square bracket and then some kind of item in there. It could be a string, so maybe a string of names. Right, so that's basically an array with 3 names inside of it. You can also create an array simply by doing something like this. Make sure you have your console open, just hit inspect element and go over to console. And then from here you could say new array. Okay, it's the same thing, but typically the shorthand array literal version is just open brackets. And as you can see, we're not getting an error. That means JavaScript actually understands what that square bracket opening and closing means. So you can't just simply write something like this. JavaScript's not going to understand that. But the new keyword with capital A there, it'll understand that, but more easily you can just do square brackets. So again, these are helpful when we're working with lists, right? So lists are pretty common across the web, right? If you go to, say, even a website like apple.com, with JavaScript, you could compose an array or a list of all of, say, the headers on this page. So think of this as like a header, right, where they have the larger text, and here's a paragraph, and then there's another paragraph. If we go down, here's yet another header and a paragraph. So you're starting to see a repeated format kind of going down this page, right? So we could technically use JavaScript to grab all of these headers and store them in an array. And that's a very common operation. That's why I brought up this example. It might feel a little strange if you're not used to using JavaScript on a web page. And we'll look at that down the line, but that's an example. You might store elements inside an array. Likewise, I might have an H2 here, you know, kind of that same Apple format, and I might have a paragraph under it. And then this might be repeated down my page with some images and things like that. And it's a very common structure for a page. You'll see that across the board. And you may want to reach into the page and grab all of these elements and then do something with the JavaScript. Maybe when the mouse hovers over it, each one gets larger or something like that. So we need to be able to store things in an array and then loop through them. We looked at loops recently, so there's a practical example. So how do we do this? Let's get used to arrays really quick. So the first thing we can do with arrays, and a very common thing you'll do, is store them in a variable. So I can come up with a name like just, you know, ARR for array, and there's an empty array there. So from here, what I could do is I could add things to this array. I could say, okay, we have this empty array. Now in the computer's memory, let's add some things to an array. Let's do ARR. And we can do push, and then push maybe a string like John. And I could also do push and maybe push a number in there as well. So now if we logged out the array after doing these two functions, these push functions, let's see what happens. Just log out that actual variable itself. It was empty, but we did these 2 lines. And now in the memory of the browser, it should look different. So if I save it and refresh here, there we go. It's not an empty array anymore. It's got 2 things in there. And we can just kind of look at it before and after as well if we want. So this is what it looks like right after we create it, and then we pushed a couple things onto the array. So that's a special method there. There we go. There's its empty version, and then here we go again. It's logged out now with stuff inside of it. So push is a special keyword that allows us to add things to an array. And likewise, we can even pop things out of an array. It's kind of the opposite. So we could say pop and let's log that. So console.log. Let's log the array now and see what it looks like. And there we go. It's pulled out that last item from the array. So you can do things like that with an array. Now, more importantly, you can also access particular elements inside of an array. And that's very useful. Let's say you have an array with many elements inside of it. So let's just say we have 3 names for now. If I save that and refresh it and then log this out and refresh it again, there we go. Now we can see that there are 3 names in the array. Now, what if I just wanted to see what was in the second slot of the array? So again, extrapolate this into a real world example. What if you want to only affect the second header on a page, not the first or the third? How do you access that, right? We can store it all in an array, and I'll show you how to grab things from a page and store them later. But for now, let's just look at the basics. How do I access the second element of the array? Well, the way you do that is imagine there's an imaginary number, okay? Assume there's an imaginary number for each of these slots in the array. Okay, so this first element here, we'll say it's 0. It starts with 0. Okay, 0 and then 1, 2. So these imaginary numbers starting with 0 are assigned to each slot here. And we can access those particular slots just by saying array, the name of that variable, and then this bracket notation, and we'll just put 1 here. So if I log this out, okay, console.log, this value here will translate into this right here, because this is the 0 slot, this is the 1 slot. Watch. And there you go. We just checked and pulled out, or essentially accessed, it's called array access. We were able to access that second element of that array. And so likewise, we looked at loops. We can do things like loop through an array and do certain things. And you'll see this is a very common operation. We could do something like this. We could write a for loop. So remember, the format is like this. And then, like every for loop, we have to say variable. And we come up with like a temporary variable. We can call it x. And we'll start it out at 0 because, as we know, this is slot 0, this is slot 1, this would be slot 2. And again, just to demonstrate that, let's look at what's in slot 0. And the way we do it is access it like that, right? If we look at slot 2, we're going to get that third element. So remember, it starts at 0. It can be a little bit tricky, but there are 3 elements and it starts at 0. And just really quick before I continue with this loop, you could also do array.length, and it'll tell you how many elements are in the array. And we're about to use that here. So just like we did with loops, we can then go x is less than array.length, because that's the maximum number of items in the array. So we're going to loop through each one at a maximum of 3 times. And then we need to increment x so that each time it loops, we loop through and get a different value. And we affect this one first, then we'll go and affect this one. So check this out. We can just do something like this. Console.log. We'll log out some text. Hi. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're logging out in the console some text. Hi, I'm, and then a space, and then whatever this translates to. And what this is we're just taking that variable name for this array, and we're checking what's in value 0, right? The first time we loop through this temporary variable x is 0. So you could just assume the first time we're looping through, it looks like that. And we saw that array 0 will grab the first element of this array. So it'll say, hi, I'm John. And then, remember how for loops work. After we execute whatever is in here, we could have multiple lines in here if we want, doing different things. Once this is done, right, so it finishes after this semicolon, it increments x. So x was 0, it's going to change x to 1 with this. And then it's going to check and see if this is still true or not. Is x less than the length of this array? If it is, go to the next one. So since this is 3 and this will be 1, it'll be 1 is less than 3, and we'll access this second element. So let's just see what this looks like. Change this to x so that every time it loops through, we'll see a different result. When I save it and refresh, there you go. You'll get 3 different statements. Now that might be a little tricky for you to kind of absorb, but just play around with this. You can mess around with how many elements are in the array. You can even put nested arrays in here if you want to get really complex. So you can get really, complex with arrays and do a lot of fun things with them. So just play around until you kind of let this kind of sink in and try out some of these functions that we were messing around with on these arrays.